Thank you, David, for that introduction. Before moving into the presentation itself, I just want to clarify the term outsourcing. From Vested's point of view, we define outsourcing in the same way that economists would do so. That is, outsourcing is any activity that is carried out by an outside provider on behalf of an organisation. This can mean the provision of services or the supply of components or materials that the organisation may use internally. The same vested principles can be applied regardless of the nature of the goods or service that are being procured. And as we'll discuss during the presentation, the benefits of a vested approach increase the more the outsourced provider can use their knowledge and expertise to create value for the parties involved. Now, Vested, while only coming to Australia now, has an excellent pedigree. It is based on research carried out by the University of Tennessee into what made some performance-based contracts successful, whereas others were a complete mess. The research was so interesting to the United States Air Force, who spend some 50% of their budget on outside services, that they contributed funding to this project. Now, this research has led to a whole series of books that describe the research and its findings, and importantly, it has converted the findings and research into a recipe that can be used to create or convert deals to become vested. So to account for why the research was conducted and why organisations such as the United States Air Force or the International Association of Commercial and Contract Management were keen to be involved, there must be a problem, right? So, how's that outsourcing going for you? These two surveys capture the essence of the problem for both customers and service providers. A few customers are experiencing significant impacts on their ability to perform and meet their own customers' expectations because of outsourced elements of their supply chain that just aren't working as they should be. Now, while root causes can be many and varied, this issue has moved up to third on the list of reasons for supply chain disruptions. But even if you're an outsourcer that has not been impacted in such a major way, you may well be sitting in the 75% of people in the second survey who are thinking, I should be doing better than this, or I'm not getting the benefits I thought I would from this arrangement. Now, while only 25% of the dissatisfied will take action to exit the arrangement, the level of dissatisfaction is disturbing. There is a lot of unrealized value in outsourcing arrangements. Outsourcing arrangements can also suffer from the watermelon scorecard problem, otherwise known as green scorecards, red faces. A service provider conducts business exactly as the customer specifies and measures the results which meet the target. Unfortunately, the results, the bottom line for the business outsourcing, fail to show the expected benefits. Surely there must be something that the service provider is doing wrong. In the end, the customer is getting exactly what they contracted and paid for. It just wasn't what they needed. The research by the Vested team at the University of Tennessee identified 10 ailments that afflict outsourcing deals. And in some cases, the ailment may only cause a slight sniffle, or it might be so bad that you should be home in bed. The task for you here today is to think about these ailments and the deals you might be involved with and ask yourself, do I suffer from this ailment? And if so, how badly? The first ailment is penny wise and pound foolish. And this occurs when a company outsources based purely on costs. In the end, you get what you pay for. And this ailment has been described as stepping over $1 to pick up 5 cents. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Oliver Williamson pointed out that you should leave money on the table when doing a deal. It builds trust and commitment, and in the end, the most expensive deal is the one that fails. The second ailment is the outsourcing paradox, and this happens when a buyer hires an expert service provider and then proceeds to tell them precisely how to do the work, usually with a massive scope of works document you can't pole vault over, and which leaves no freedom for the expert service provider to exercise their knowledge to save you money. We often find that the creators of such large scope of works documents know a great deal about the wrong way to carry out a task. The third element is the activity trap. This is where the more transactions performed, the more money the service provider makes, which means that there's no incentive for improvement. We see this, for example, in the 3PL industry, where the service provider could help the customer reduce inventory, but to do so would reduce income from storing pallets. A real catch-22. The fourth element we term the junkyard dog factor. This is where retained internal experts micromanage the contract. All too often the mindset is, we really don't trust these service providers, so we'll keep Joe on board to keep them honest. Joe's job then takes on a council compliance officer flavour, in that if he isn't picking issues, he isn't earning his salary. Joe was also most likely involved in producing the scope of works we talked about earlier. The fifth element is the honeymoon effect. This is where the provider initially goes overboard to perform, but drops back over time as other clients come on board. Even the most upright of service providers finds it hard to maintain focus on a client when another new client comes on board. The sixth element is sandbagging. So to prevent the honeymoon effect, some companies adopt hard measures to encourage service providers to perform, but this can lead to minimalist results. If you're a service provider who's found a 15% cost saving, but you have a hard target for 5% cost savings per year, do you pass on the full 15%, or do you meter it out at 5% per year? Sergei Bubka was paid $50,000 every time he broke the world record for the pole vault. In 1 year, he broke it 35 times, by about 1 centimetre each time. Pure chance or sandbagging? The seventh element is the zero-sum game, and this is one of the most common ailments. Companies believe, mistakenly, that if something's good for the service provider, then it is automatically bad for them. They've missed the whole point about the mechanisms that can work to make the pie bigger for both parties. The eighth element is driving blind disease, and this occurs where there is no formal governance process to monitor the performance of the relationship. Nothing is going to tempt a service provider more than the thought that any opportunistic behaviour on their part won't be detectable by the customer. The ninth element, and one I love pronouncing, is measurement minutiae. Too much of a good thing can be bad for you, and this applies to fast food and to measuring service providers. Too many KPIs and they start to form themselves into tiers. And how many times will tier 2 or tier 3 KPIs be looked at? That's right, rarely. And the last and perhaps saddest of the ailments is the power of not doing. This is where the outsourcing business has performance measures, but just doesn't use them, often linked with the over-measurement problem referred to in ailment 9. So clearly there's a problem worth addressing, and we need to take account of the wise words of Albert here. We aren't going to solve this by doing the same thing as we do now, but better or harder. It will take a much different approach to resolve the issues and release the pent-up value that is hidden away in our outsourcing deals. So, is there a better way to undertake outsourcing? Can we avoid the 10 ailments and release the value contained in our outsourcing arrangements? Luckily, there is a solution, and it's called Vested. Since the original research was published, the idea has been developed and has been enhanced through a series of books that flow from why the vested approach is needed, what is the vested approach, how you might go about implementing the vested approach, and finally the stories of organisations that have successfully implemented vested. And the reason this approach is called vested is that done properly, these arrangements result in both parties to the arrangement being vested in the success of the other. Now, vested is a hybrid contracting model that aims to occupy a position that has the economic benefits of outsourcing with the relationship benefits of an in-house sourcing program. It shifts the focus from outsourcing transactions to buying outcomes. And importantly, it switches focus from fighting over the pie to growing the pie. Now, at the same time, it's not a soft approach. It has well-defined outcomes and well-thought-out governance processes. And when you implement a vested agreement, you're buying change and you're buying the future. At the core of a vested agreement, you have 5 rules, which are based around a win-win, what's in it for we approach. Focus on outcomes, not transactions, is the first rule. Rule number 2, focus on the what, not the how. Rule number 3, agree on clearly defined and measurable outcomes. Rule number 4, optimize pricing model incentives. And finally, rule number 5, governance structures should provide insight, not merely oversight to the business. And if you think back to the 10 ailments that we looked at earlier, you can see how each of the ailments are addressed by the 5 rules. Now, in most outsourcing deals, people are just more comfortable contracting for labour units or physical services. And of course, the more of these labour inputs or physical activities are carried out, the more revenue the service provider gets. Clearly, there's no incentive for improvement, as Dilbert's boss is indicating here. Vested outsourcing takes an outcomes-based approach. For example, Rolls-Royce has vested leasing arrangements with the airlines where they get paid for the hours that the engine spends in the air flying, not how much maintenance they have to do on the engine. This changes the whole incentive structure to one where breakdowns and lengthening maintenance periods are not attractive, as perhaps they would be under a transactions-based approach. A similar approach is taken by General Electric and the United States Air Force for the F404 engine for the FA-18 Hornet, and this has resulted in a reduction in repair turnaround time from 120 to 47 days. And a reduction in the total cost of ownership for the program of some $79 million US. Now, rule number 2, focus on the what, not the how. Joy's law here highlights a reality that your organisation can't expect to be expert on every matter, particularly around an area that you are outsourcing because it's non-core to your business. This is why overly prescriptive scope of works are a bad idea. By leaving the how to your service provider, you will unleash their creativity on the problem. And this is illustrated by the challenge that small convenience stores in Japan had. How to make watermelons fit into their space-constrained supply chains and stores, as well as their customers' small home fridges. By throwing the problem out to their growers, the solution: square watermelons. I'm sure that's what you would have thought of first. Now, just because you're contracting for something that's different from the easily measured transactions you might have been used to in the past, doesn't mean that you can't develop tangible measures for those outcomes. In fact, if you don't do so, you might end up a bit like Yogi here. Rule number 3 is one of the key areas that shows vested isn't a fairly soft approach to contracting, but make sure not to go overboard and set yourself up for ailment 9. It's also important to jointly develop the performance measures between the customer and service provider. Measures that are imposed by one party on the other tend to have a negative effect on the relationship. Allied to the issue of measurements is the problem with perverse incentives, as highlighted in the example of the Hanoi rat bounty. Now, this type of problem with colonial administrations was not unusual. The team from Freakonomics have a similar story involving India, where the British put a bounty on cobras, which resulted in snake farming, and then a spike in population of cobras when the bounty was cancelled and the farm cobra were released. Similar stories are told in the IT industry, where programmers are rewarded for each bug they find in the program they're writing. In the end, the designers of such reward systems are undone by the law of unintended consequences. The pricing model is the engine room of value creation in a vested agreement. This is where both parties get incentivized to grow the pie. It is also important to make sure that risk and reward are balanced. Neither party should take on risks they're not being compensated for. And traditional contracts are quite bad at this in that they try and dump or shift risk rather than manage it. Solo's law comes from a Nobel Prize-winning economist who studied the drivers of economic growth. His finding that labour and physical capital only make up 13% of economic growth should be of particular interest to those outsourcing transactions. It means that potentially you're missing out on the gains to be made in the other 87% of the economic growth pie. And as mentioned earlier with Vested, you're buying change in the future, and getting the pricing model right can be the hardest part of a vested deal, but the impact is well worth the effort. An important part of the vested approach is the implementation of robust governance structures that both help build and strengthen the relationship, while at the same time ensuring the arrangement delivers both the value the parties are looking for. The processes range from a series of business reviews which look to the clearly defined outcomes from Rule 3 to understand how the business is performing, to a decision-making process that emphasises joint responsibility and decision-making. Now, part of this approach is to put personnel from each party together to manage a particular activity or level of responsibility. This process, called two in a box, makes sure that all decisions are made at the right level by the right people. If a two in a box can't solve an issue, then they can escalate it to the appropriate pair above them until it reaches the business review level. Our experience is that most issues get fixed much lower down than this. So the 5 rules have been converted into a recipe that organisations can follow to implement a sound vested deal. And these steps are outlined in this manual, but we would recommend that you and your partner jointly go through the online course that mirrors these 10 steps. Each step comes with homework that comes together at the end of the process to create your vested agreement. So when people come to a conference like this and hear about a new approach to business like vested, the first thought is always, yes, but does it work? The vested team has gone to great lengths to get people who have adopted this approach to help us write up case studies. And while you can get many of these cases from the vestedway.com website, the long version have all been collated into this new book. And as you'll see from the names here, the organisations involved range from large multinational firms to government authorities. There are also smaller organisations who have benefited from the use of vested. To give you a flavour for the types of benefits, we've included an overview of one of the cases. Microsoft and Accenture came together to set up a vested deal to outsource Microsoft's financial services. It's worth noting that there was no scope of works or baseline in this deal. Existing systems globally were too fragmented to get a handle on. The results were a win-win for the business itself, with dramatic improvements in the service levels and performance, with results such as a 20% increase in the first pass matching, meaning less rework had to be done, and the freeing up of staff from tactical to more valuable work that created value for the business user community. The purchasing and finance communities within the business won through reductions in expenditure and realised value through innovation. Who wouldn't be pleased with a 20% reduction in costs? The cost model also makes these savings hard rather than soft. And finally, the service provider won through contract extensions and increases in the scope of business gained. Everybody won through a what's in it for we deal. Now, it's always good when people say nice things about you, so here's a range of comments from some key people in the area of deal making. So we've been recognised by some of the leading think tanks in the procurement, contracting and outsourcing space, as well as by some of our key clients and the business press. It's of course hard to cover a subject like Vested in such a short time, so if you want to know more, then please visit the Vested website, where you will find a mountain of material, or contact the presenters here today. Now this slide shows some of the services that can be accessed via the website. It's also worth mentioning that the Vested approach is not a consultant-driven approach. It's something that you have to do yourself along with your partner. And while you can purchase the books and get started without any additional help, we would recommend you take the online training courses that can be accessed on the Vested Way website. Some of these courses are at no charge, so well worth doing. The Vested faculty in the USA and Australia can also help you in your Vested journey by providing independent assessments of your deals and your relationships with outsourcing partners. This could be for a greenfield deal or what we call a flip, where we convert an existing deal so that it becomes vested. If you look at the case studies on the website or read the longer versions in the book, you will see a number of the success stories were indeed flips. So thanks very much for your attention. Are there any questions at all?